Jason didn't know it yet, but by the end of the day, he'd witness a fire truck, an axe, and one very expensive lesson in karma, all thanks to Karen. It all began with a cup of coffee and a scream. Who the hell parked in the fire lane? Jason nearly spilled his medium roast as the shout echoed through the otherwise peaceful suburban morning. He peeked out from his porch and immediately spotted the culprit, Karen's monstrous black SUV, a vehicle so unnecessarily large it could double as a mobile fortress. And where was it parked? Smack dab in the middle of the neighborhood's fire lane, as if she'd mistaken it for her personal driveway. Now, Jason lived in a neighborhood governed by one of those HOAs, the kind that sends you passive-aggressive letters if your mailbox leans 2 degrees too far to the left. Fire lanes were sacred ground here, marked with bold red paint and stern warnings about towing and fines. But Karen? Karen had never met a rule she couldn't ignore. Jason sighed. Of course it was Karen. Who else? Karen was the neighborhood's reigning queen of entitlement. She was the type who'd call animal control on your cat for trespassing on her lawn, but would let her own dog bark at 3 a.m. without a second thought. She once complained that Jason's recycling bin was too close to her property line, even though it wasn't, and had been known to host impromptu karaoke nights that could be heard 3 streets over. But this? Blocking the fire lane? Even for Karen, this was bold. Jason debated whether to intervene. On one hand, it wasn't his problem. On the other hand, fire lanes existed for emergencies, not Karen's convenience. But before he could decide, a new distraction emerged. A team of workers unloading what appeared to be an inflatable pool slide? Oh no! Jason groaned as he realized what was happening. Karen was throwing one of her infamous pool parties. These weren't just any pool parties, they were full-blown suburban ravers, complete with blaring music, questionable margaritas, and enough inflatable flamingos to populate an entire zoo exhibit. And now she'd decided that blocking emergency access was a perfectly reasonable trade-off for hosting Karenchella. By mid-morning, the chaos had begun in earnest. Guests arrived in droves, parking haphazardly along the street while hauling coolers and folding chairs toward Karen's backyard oasis. The music started, top 40 hits from 5 years ago, and kids began screaming as they launched themselves down the towering slide that loomed over her fence like some garish plastic monument to bad taste. Jason tried to ignore it. Really, he did. He put on his noise-canceling headphones and mowed his lawn with more intensity than necessary, hoping to drown out the racket. But every time he glanced toward the fire lane, there it was, Karen's SUV, still defiantly parked as if daring anyone to challenge her authority. And here's where things got interesting. Jason wasn't alone in his frustration. Across the street, Mrs. Thompson, the neighborhood's self-appointed HOA enforcer, was pacing back and forth like a tiger in a cage, clutching her clipboard and muttering under her breath about violations and community standards. Meanwhile, Mr. Patel next door kept shaking his head every time another car squeezed into an illegal parking spot near his driveway. It was as if Karen's audacity had united the entire block in silent outrage. But no one said anything, not yet. Because everyone knew how these things went with Karen, confrontation would only lead to drama, yelling matches, and possibly another passive-aggressive Facebook post about how some people needed to mind their own business. So instead, they waited and watched and stewed in collective annoyance. By noon, Jason had given up on yard work and retreated inside to escape both the noise and his rising blood pressure. He made himself another cup of coffee, dark roast this time because he needed something stronger, and sat down at his computer to vent on Reddit. Karen strikes again, he typed into r/HOA nightmares before launching into a detailed rant about the blocked fire lane and impending pool party disaster. The responses came flooding in almost immediately. Classic Karen move. You should call the fire department just to see what happens. Does your HOA actually enforce anything? Ours would have towed that SUV by now. Please tell me you're documenting this for future generations. Jason chuckled despite himself as he scrolled through the comments. At least he wasn't alone in dealing with neighbors like Karen. Apparently, suburban hellscapes like this existed everywhere. But just as he was starting to feel better about ignoring the situation altogether, something happened that changed everything. From outside came another shout, this one louder than before, "There's smoke." Jason froze mid-sip before bolting toward his window. Sure enough, a thin plume of gray smoke was rising from somewhere down the street, not from Karen's house but close enough that alarm bells, literal and metaphorical, started ringing in his head. And then came the sirens. The fire truck arrived within minutes, an impressive response time that would have been even more impressive if they'd been able to reach their destination without obstruction. But guess what stood between them and their path? That's right, Karen's SUV. Jason watched from his porch as firefighters jumped out of their truck looking equal parts confused and annoyed at finding their route blocked by what could only be described as an ego on wheels. "Oh boy," Jason muttered under his breath as he grabbed another cup of coffee, this time purely for entertainment purposes. Because if karma was real, things were about to get very interesting indeed. The fire truck screeched to a halt, its sirens blaring, only to find itself face-to-face with Karen's SUV, the suburban fortress that had no business being parked where it was. Jason, still clutching his coffee like it was a front-row ticket to the best show in town, leaned against his porch railing and watched the scene unfold. He could almost hear the collective groan of the firefighters as they stepped out of the truck and assessed the situation. One of them, a burly guy with a mustache, so thick it probably had its own zip code, walked up to the SUV and gave it a once-over. He tried the door handle, locked, of course, and then turned back to his crew with a look that said, "You've got to be kidding me." Jason couldn't help but chuckle. This was Karen. She didn't just block a fire lane, she locked her car in place like she was guarding the crown jewels. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood had started to gather, drawn by the sirens and the growing plume of smoke in the distance. Mrs. Thompson was there, clutching her clipboard like it was a weapon. Mr. Patel had come out too, shaking his head in that way that said he was already mentally drafting an angry email to the HOA board. Even the kids from Karen's pool party had stopped sliding down the inflatable monstrosity to gawk at what was happening. And then, right on cue, Karen herself appeared. She came strutting out of her backyard like she was walking onto a red carpet, wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a plastic cup filled with what Jason could only assume was some kind of aggressively fruity cocktail. Her expression shifted from confusion to indignation as she realized what was going on. "What's all this commotion?" she demanded, waving her cup around like it was a scepter. The mustached firefighter turned to her, clearly unimpressed. "Ma'am," he said in that calm yet deadly tone that only first responders and customer service reps can pull off, "is this your vehicle?" Karen blinked at him like he'd just asked her to explain quantum physics. "Well, yes," she said, drawing out the words as if they were somehow supposed to absolve her of responsibility. "Why?" "Because it's blocking our access to an active fire," he replied, gesturing toward the smoke now billowing higher into the sky. "We need you to move it immediately." Now, any reasonable person would have apologized profusely at this point and sprinted for their keys. But Karen? Oh no. Karen wasn't about to let something as trivial as public safety ruin her day. "I don't see what the big deal is," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "It's not like my car is in anyone's way." Jason nearly choked on his coffee. Not in anyone's way? The fire truck was practically kissing her bumper. He glanced around at his neighbors, all of whom looked equally dumbfounded by her audacity. The firefighter took a deep breath, the kind you take when you're trying really hard not to lose your cool, and said, "Ma'am, if you don't move your vehicle right now, we're going to have to move it for you." That got Karen's attention. Her sunglasses slipped down her nose as she stared at him in disbelief. "Excuse me," she said, her voice climbing an octave. "You can't just move my car. That's private property." Jason could feel the tension building like a pressure cooker about to explode. This wasn't just a parking dispute anymore, this was a full-blown showdown between Karen and reality itself. And reality was about to win in spectacular fashion. "Ma'am," the firefighter said again, his patience clearly wearing thin, "there is an emergency situation happening right now. If you don't cooperate..." But Karen cut him off with a dramatic gasp that wouldn't have been out of place in a soap opera. "This is harassment," she declared loudly enough for everyone within a 3-block radius to hear. "I pay my taxes. I have rights. You can't treat me like this." At this point, Jason had given up any pretense of subtlety and was openly laughing into his coffee mug. The sheer absurdity of it all was too much, Karen standing there in her pool party attire, arguing with firefighters while an actual fire burned nearby. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, horrible but impossible to look away from. The mustached firefighter exchanged a glance with one of his colleagues, a silent conversation that probably went something like, "Can you believe this, lady?" before turning back to Karen and saying firmly, "Last chance, move your car or we'll move it for you." Karen crossed her arms and planted herself firmly in front of the SUV like some kind of suburban martyr defending her territory. "I'm not moving until you apologize for threatening me," she announced defiantly. And that's when things got interesting. Without another word, the firefighters sprang into action. One of them retrieved an axe from the truck, a big one, and walked straight toward Karen's SUV with all the determination of someone who dealt with one too many Karens in their career. Karen's jaw dropped as she realized what was happening. "Wait, what are you doing?" "You can't do that," she shrieked. But they could do that, and they did. With practiced efficiency, they smashed through one of the SUV's windows, safety glass flying everywhere, and unlocked the doors from the inside while another firefighter hooked up chains to tow it out of the way. Karen screamed louder than Jason thought humanly possible, a sound so shrill it probably scared off every bird within a 5-mile radius, but there was nothing she could do except watch helplessly as her precious vehicle was unceremoniously dragged down the street. The crowd erupted into applause. Jason glanced around at his neighbors and saw smiles on faces that hadn't smiled in years, not because they were happy about someone else's misfortune, okay, maybe just a little, but because justice had finally been served. As for Karen, she stood there speechless for once in her life, her sunglasses askew and her cocktail forgotten as reality came crashing down around her. And Jason? Well, he poured himself another cup of coffee because this day wasn't over yet, not by a long shot, but for now, it felt pretty damn satisfying watching karma do its thing so beautifully. As Karen's SUV was dragged down the street like a defeated gladiator being hauled out of the arena, Jason thought the show was over. He had his coffee, he had his laughs, and he figured karma had done its job. But oh no, this was Karen we were dealing with. And if there's one thing Karen can't stand, it's losing, especially in front of an audience. Karen stood there for a moment, frozen in disbelief, as if her brain couldn't quite process what had just happened. Her sunglasses were now perched crookedly on her nose, her plastic cup of neon pink cocktail forgotten in her hand, and her mouth hung open in a way that made her look like a fish gasping for air. But then it hit her. The rage. The righteous indignation that only a Karen could muster. "This is outrageous," she shrieked, spinning around to face the firefighters like they'd just insulted her entire bloodline. "You had no right to touch my car. I'm calling the police." "No, wait, I'm calling my lawyer." Jason nearly spit out his coffee. Calling her lawyer? Over this? He could barely contain his laughter as Karen whipped out her phone and began furiously tapping at the screen, presumably Googling, "Can firefighters legally smash my window?" Meanwhile, the firefighters were entirely unfazed. They had a job to do, and Karen's tantrum wasn't going to stop them. With the fire lane now clear, they hopped back into their truck and sped off toward the burning house down the street, leaving Karen standing there like a cartoon villain whose evil plan had just been foiled. But Karen wasn't done. Oh no. She turned to the crowd of neighbors that had gathered, because by now, half the block was out there watching this train wreck unfold, and started ranting like she was delivering a closing argument in court. "Did you see what they did?" she shouted, pointing dramatically at the retreating fire truck. "They destroyed my property. This is an abuse of power. I'm going to sue them. I'm going to sue all of them." Jason exchanged a look with Mrs. Thompson, who was still clutching her clipboard like it was some kind of holy relic. "Is she serious?" Jason whispered, though he already knew the answer. Of course she was serious. Karen never joked about things like this because Karen didn't joke about anything ever. The crowd murmured awkwardly as Karen continued her tirade, pacing back and forth like some kind of deranged motivational speaker. She ranted about how she paid taxes, a lot of taxes, apparently, how she knew her rights, all of them, and how this entire situation was an attack on her personal freedom because nothing says freedom like blocking a fire lane. But here's the thing about Karens, they thrive on attention. And when people stop giving it to them, they lose their power faster than a phone with 1% battery life. One by one, the neighbors started drifting away, muttering excuses about needing to check on their kids or finish mowing their lawns or just not wanting to be within earshot of Karen anymore. Even Mrs. Thompson eventually threw up her hands and walked off, muttering something about filing an official complaint later. Jason stayed behind for a bit longer, not because he wanted to listen to Karen's ranting, he didn't, but because he couldn't resist seeing how far she'd take this. And boy, did she take it far. When Karen realized her audience was gone, she switched tactics. She stormed back into her house and emerged minutes later with, wait for it, a megaphone. Yes, a megaphone. Jason couldn't believe his eyes as she marched back onto her driveway and started yelling into it like some kind of unhinged town crier. "Attention neighbors," she bellowed, her voice amplified to ear-splitting levels. "I have been victimized by the very people who are supposed to protect us. This is an injustice." Jason shook his head in disbelief. Was this real life? Was he actually witnessing this? He glanced over at Mr. Patel next door, who was standing on his porch with his arms crossed and an expression that said he was seriously considering moving to another zip code. But then something amazing happened. From down the street came another sound, a sound that Jason hadn't heard in years but instantly recognized: laughter. It started as a single chuckle from one of the neighbors who'd stuck around out of morbid curiosity. Then another person joined in. And another. And before long, half the block was laughing, a real, genuine belly laughs that echoed through the neighborhood like music. Because honestly, the sight of Karen standing there with her megaphone yelling about injustice while wearing pool party flip-flops and a sun big enough to double as an umbrella, it was too much. Even Jason couldn't keep a straight face anymore. Karen froze mid-rant when she realized what was happening, the laughter cutting through her indignation like a knife through butter. "What's so funny?" she demanded into the megaphone, which only made everyone laugh harder. Jason finally decided he'd had enough entertainment for one day and headed back inside before Karen could turn her wrath on him specifically, because let's be real, that was probably next on her list. As he closed his front door behind him and set down his now empty coffee mug, he couldn't help but feel satisfied. Sure, Karen would probably spend the next week filing complaints with anyone who would listen and plenty who wouldn't. And sure, there'd likely be some kind of HOA meeting about all this where everyone would pretend not to roll their eyes while she ranted about her rights. But for now, justice had been served and served hot. And Jason? Well, he couldn't wait to see what Reddit thought of this whole mess when he posted about it later that night. Because if there's one thing suburban life has taught him, it's that sometimes reality is funnier than fiction and way more satisfying too. By the time Jason sat down on his couch with a fresh cup of coffee and opened up Reddit to share the latest chapter of the Karen Chronicles, he thought he'd seen it all. The SUV had been smashed and dragged away, Karen had delivered her megaphone manifesto, and the neighborhood had collectively laughed her off the stage. Surely that was the end of it. Surely Karen would retreat into her house, nurse her wounded pride, and plot her next HOA violation in peace. But no. Because Karen wasn't just any suburban antagonist, she was a professional. And when Karen decides she's been wronged, she doesn't just let it go. She escalates. Jason was halfway through typing his Reddit post, update, Karen brought out a megaphone when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of Karen's voice booming from across the street again. This time though, she wasn't yelling at her neighbors or firefighters. No, this time Karen was on the phone. And not just any phone call, this was the kind of phone call you could hear from 3 houses away because Karen wanted everyone to know she meant business. "I want to speak to your supervisor," she screeched, pacing back and forth on her driveway like a general preparing for battle. "No, I don't care about your policies. This is unacceptable." Jason didn't even need to guess who she was talking to, it had to be someone from the fire department. Or maybe it was her insurance company. Either way, whoever was on the other end of that call deserved hazard pay. Karen's rant continued for what felt like an eternity, filled with phrases like property damage, legal action, and I know my rights. Jason couldn't help but wonder if Karen actually knew her rights or if she just liked saying that because it sounded intimidating. Either way, it was clear she wasn't backing down anytime soon. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had returned to its usual rhythm, or at least tried to. Kids were back on their bikes, Mrs. Thompson was pruning her rose bushes with a vengeance, probably imagining they were Karen's megaphone, and Mr. Patel had retreated indoors to avoid further exposure to Karen's nonsense. But Jason? Jason stayed put. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't over yet and he wasn't about to miss Act 3 of the suburban soap opera. Sure enough, about an hour later, there was another knock at Jason's door. He opened it to find Mrs. Thompson standing there with her clipboard and an expression that could only be described as "I'm about to ruin someone's day." "Jason," she said briskly, "we need to talk about Karen." Jason suppressed a laugh because honestly, that sentence could apply to any day in this neighborhood, but nodded politely and invited her in. Mrs. Thompson wasted no time getting down to business. She flipped open her clipboard and began rattling off a list of HOA violations Karen had committed during her pool party extravaganza. Illegal parking, obviously, excessive noise levels, no surprise there, improper use of public spaces. Apparently, she'd set up a second inflatable slide on the sidewalk and wait for it, unauthorized installation of outdoor decorations, the flamingos. Jason couldn't believe his ears. Flamingos? That was what pushed Mrs. Thompson over the edge? Not the fire lane fiasco or the megaphone speech, but the flamingos. "I've already drafted a formal complaint," Mrs. Thompson continued, oblivious to Jason's amusement, "but I need witnesses to corroborate these violations." Jason raised an eyebrow. Witnesses? For flamingos? Was this really happening? But before he could respond, Mrs. Thompson handed him a pen and pointed at the bottom of her complaint form where there was a blank line marked signature. Jason hesitated for a moment, not because he didn't want to sign, he absolutely did, but because he couldn't shake the feeling that this whole situation was spiraling into something even more ridiculous than he'd anticipated. Still, he signed it anyway because hey, anything that held Karen accountable was worth supporting. By the time Mrs. Thompson left with her clipboard full of signatures from half the block, including Mr. Patel who signed without even reading it, Jason felt like they'd formed some sort of unofficial anti-Karen alliance. A group united not by shared interests but by shared frustration. And then came the cherry on top. Just as Jason was settling back onto his couch for what he hoped would be some much-needed relaxation time, there was another knock at his door. This time it wasn't Mrs. Thompson, it was Karen. Jason froze for a moment before opening the door cautiously because let's be real, you never know what you're going to get when Karen shows up unannounced. Sure enough, there she stood, sunglasses back in place, cocktail replaced by what looked like legal documents, and an expression that screamed I'm about to ruin your day. Jason, she began in that overly sweet tone people use when they're trying really hard not to sound angry but failing miserably, I understand you've been talking about me behind my back. Jason blinked at her in confusion because honestly, he hadn't said anything about her directly unless you count Reddit posts which don't really count, but before he could respond, Karen thrust the papers into his hands. I've drafted a cease and desist letter, she announced proudly as if this were some kind of victory lap. Jason stared at the papers in disbelief because who drafts cease and desist letters for neighbors? Was this real life? Karen continued rambling about defamation laws and slander while Jason skimmed through what could only be described as legal gibberish written by someone who probably Googled, how do I sue my neighbor 5 minutes ago? And then, Jason did something unexpected. He laughed. Not just chuckled, but full-on belly laughed right there in front of Karen, who looked absolutely horrified by his reaction. Karen, he said finally between laughs. You can't be serious. But judging by her expression, oh yes, she was dead serious. And that's when Jason realized something important. No matter how ridiculous things got, no matter how many cease and desist letters or megaphones or flamingos were involved, there would always be one universal truth about suburban life. Karen would always be Karen. And honestly, that might just be okay, because without her, life would be way less entertaining anyway. Jason stood there on his porch holding Karen's so-called cease and desist letter, still chuckling to himself as she glared at him, arms crossed and sunglasses perched dramatically on her nose. It was the kind of glare that could curdle milk. But Jason? He wasn't fazed. At this point, Karen had gone from being a neighborhood nuisance to a full-blown sitcom character, and he was just along for the ride. Karen, he said finally, folding the papers neatly and handing them back to her, this is adorable. Truly. But you can't just hand someone a piece of paper you printed off the internet and call it a legal document. Karen gasped like he'd just insulted her entire ancestry. This is not from the internet, she snapped, snatching the papers back. I consulted with a professional. Jason raised an eyebrow. Did you pay this professional, or was it one of those free consultations where they tell you to stop wasting their time? For a moment, Karen looked like she might explode. Her face turned red, her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, and Jason could practically see the steam coming out of her ears. But instead of responding, she turned on her heel and stormed off, muttering something about how people like him were what's wrong with the world. Jason watched her go, shaking his head in disbelief. He'd dealt with Karen's antics before, everyone in the neighborhood had, but this was next-level Karen behavior. And yet, as ridiculous as it all was, he couldn't help but feel a little entertained. But here's the thing about karma, it doesn't just stop at one act of poetic justice. No, karma likes to keep things interesting. The next morning, Jason woke up to find an email from the HOA sitting in his inbox. The subject line read, Urgent, special meeting regarding recent incidents. He clicked it open and immediately burst out laughing. Apparently, Karen had filed an official complaint with the HOA about the firefighters damaging her SUV. She claimed it was an unnecessary use of force and demanded that they reimburse her for the repairs. But that wasn't all, she also accused several neighbors, including Jason, of harassment for laughing during her megaphone speech. The HOA, clearly fed up with Karen's nonsense but bound by their bylaws to address every complaint no matter how absurd, had scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss the matter. Jason could almost hear Mrs. Thompson's exasperated sighs as he read through the email. By 7 p.m., half the neighborhood had crammed into the community center for what promised to be the most entertaining HOA meeting in years. Jason arrived early to get a good seat and wasn't surprised to find Mrs. Thompson already there. armed with her clipboard and a stack of documents thicker than a phone book. Karen arrived fashionably late, of course, sweeping into the room like she was attending an awards show rather than a disciplinary hearing. She was dressed in what could only be described as courtroom chic, a blazer that looked suspiciously new and heels that clicked loudly against the tile floor as she made her way to the front of the room. The HOA president, a mild-mannered man named Bob who always looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, called the meeting to order and asked Karen to state her case. And oh boy, did she state it. For 20 minutes straight, Karen ranted about how she'd been victimized by everyone from the firefighters to her own neighbors. She waved around photos of her damaged SUV like they were exhibits in a high-profile trial, and even tried to play a recording of her megaphone speech as evidence of how she'd been treated unfairly. Jason couldn't help but notice that several people in the room were struggling not to laugh, including Bob, who kept covering his mouth with his hand every time Karen said something particularly outrageous. When Karen finally finished her tirade, Bob cleared his throat and turned to Mrs. Thompson. "Do you have anything to add?" he asked wearily. Mrs. Thompson stood up with all the confidence of someone who'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. She opened her clipboard and began reading aloud from her list of Karen's violations. Blocking a fire lane, excessive noise levels, unauthorized decorations. Yes, the flamingos made another appearance. And most damning of all, endangering public safety by refusing to move her vehicle during an emergency. Karen tried to interrupt several times but was quickly shut down by Bob, who reminded her that she'd already had plenty of time to speak. By the time Mrs. Thompson finished reading through her list, it was clear which way the wind was blowing. The other HOA board members, who rarely agreed on anything, were all nodding along in unison as if they'd just been handed irrefutable proof that Karen was guilty as charged. Bob turned back to Karen with a look that could only be described as exhausted patience. "Karen," he said slowly, "while we understand your concerns about your vehicle being damaged, we also have to prioritize public safety above all else." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but Bob held up a hand to stop her. "Furthermore," he continued, "your behavior during this incident has caused significant disruption within our community." Jason could see Karen's face turning redder by the second as Bob went on to explain that not only would she not be reimbursed for her SUV repairs, but she would also be fined for multiple HOA violations, including blocking emergency access and creating a public disturbance. The room erupted into applause. Karen stormed out moments later, muttering threats about lawsuits and vowing revenge on everyone who'd wronged her, which apparently included most of the neighborhood. But Jason just sat back in his chair with a satisfied grin on his face. Because at the end of the day, justice had been served once again, and this time with an extra helping of karma on top. So what's the moral of this story? Well, if you're going to be a Karen, maybe don't park your SUV in front of a fire lane during a pool party extravaganza. Or better yet, maybe just don't be a Karen at all. And hey, if you enjoyed this wild suburban saga as much as I did, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, leave me a comment below about your favorite part, or better yet, your own crazy HOA stories. And make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on my next tale of suburban chaos. Thanks for watching, and remember, karma's always watching too.